The girl he left in the ashes. A Montana lawman's debt of blood and redemption. What would you do if the girl you bought at an auction just to keep her alive turned out to be the child you abandoned 8 years ago in a burning village you helped destroy? This is not a story about a good man. It's about what a guilty one does when the past stops waiting and walks through the door. Montana, 1878. The truth has been buried long enough. If you're ready for a story where redemption isn't given, it's torn out of the ground at a cost, then stay with us. Like the channel, subscribe, and let's begin. The ashes are still warm. The weight of ash. The valley looked different in the morning. That was what Elias Carn told himself as he reined his horse to a stop on the ridge above Ash Creek, the early light still grey and thin across the Montana sky. He told himself the land had changed, that 8 years of weather and silence had rearranged it into something he didn't recognize. But that was a lie, and he had spent enough of his life lying to himself to know the shape of one. The valley was exactly as he remembered. The creek still ran along the western edge, silver and quiet in the pale morning. The cottonwoods still stood in clusters near the water, their bare branches reaching upward like hands. The grass was long now, thick and dark green in the low places where the soil ran deep, and in the spring light it looked almost peaceful, almost like any other stretch of Montana grassland. Almost. Elias looked down at the ground below his horse's hooves. The soil here was darker than the surrounding earth, not from moisture. The color went too deep, too even the kind of dark that doesn't wash away in rain or fade in sun. 8 years of seasons had softened it, buried it under new growth, but the darkness remained underneath like a bruise that had never fully healed. This was where the lodges had stood. He could still see the shapes of them if he looked the low mounds in the earth where post holes had been dug and filled in by time, the faint depressions where fire pits had burned. Here and there, a piece of charred wood jutted from the soil, half swallowed by grass, refusing to disappear entirely. Elias sat very still on his horse. He was not given to lingering. He had built his entire adult life around the practice of not lingering, not in any town, not in any thought, not in any memory that tried to pull him backward. He kept moving. He took work where he could find it, fencing carpentry, hauling freight along the Bozeman Road. He changed his name once and then changed it back, because changing a name, he discovered, did nothing about the face wearing it. He drank moderately. He slept lightly. He did not make friends. He did not come back to Ash Creek. Until today. He had told himself it was the road. The most direct route to Bozeman ran along the eastern ridge of the valley, and he was already behind on the errand that had brought him out this way. A simple job collecting information for a man named Pruitt, who owned a livery stable and had lent Elias money he hadn't yet paid back. Pruitt wanted to know who was running the stock auction at the old Bozeman barn, what prices were fetching, whether it was worth sending his own animals. A small errand. An easy road. But the road had brought him here. And now Elias sat on the ridge above Ash Creek and looked down at the dark ground and understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has run out of comfortable lies, that he had not come here by accident. Some part of him had needed to see it again. Some part of him had needed to look at what had been done and feel the full weight of what he had allowed. He was 25 years old. He had been 17 the night of the fire. 8 years. And the earth still wore the color of it. He exhaled slowly, tightened his grip on the reins. The horse shifted beneath him, restless, picking up some current of unease in the way horses always did when their riders were carrying something heavy. Move, he told himself. You've seen it. Now move. He nudged the horse forward along the ridge road, keeping his eyes ahead, and did not look back at the valley as the morning light grew stronger behind him and the dark soil disappeared from view. He told himself he felt nothing. He told himself that for the 3 miles between Ash Creek and Bozeman, and by the time the town appeared ahead of him, low wooden buildings, dust rising from the main road, the smell of livestock and coal smoke, he had almost convinced himself it was true. The old Bozeman stock barn sat at the eastern edge of town, a long low building with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls patched so many times with different grades of lumber that it looked like a quilt someone had given up on. It had handled cattle and horses and grain for 20 years. What it handled now was harder to put a name to, though plenty of names existed. Elias arrived early and tied his horse at the rail outside. The morning was still cool, the sun not yet high enough to burn off the chill, and men were arriving in ones and twos from the direction of town ranches. Mostly a few trappers, a handful of men whose clothing suggested they had once served in some military capacity and hadn't fully returned to civilian life. They moved with the particular unhurried purpose of men who knew what they had come for and were not troubled by it. Elias pulled his hat low and found a position near the back wall in the shadow where the light didn't reach. He had his notepad in his coat pocket, the one Pruitt had given him to write down prices. He was here to observe, to stay invisible, to do the job and leave. He was good at invisible. The barn filled slowly. The floor was packed dirt striped with pale light from the gaps in the roof boards, and the smell was hay and old wood and the particular close warmth of too many men in too small a space. Elias counted 23. Not a large crowd, not a small one either. Sheriff Wade Holloway stepped up onto the wooden platform at the center of the barn. Elias had seen Holloway before. It was hard to spend time in Bozeman without seeing him, but he had never looked at him carefully. A deliberate choice. There were men you avoided looking at carefully because you didn't want to know their faces too well, and Holloway had always struck him as one of those men. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that was slightly too fine for a territorial sheriff, with pale eyes and a smile that arrived before any warmth to justify it. He was perhaps 45. His hair was going grey at the temples. He stood on the platform with the comfortable authority of a man who had stood in exactly this position many times before. "This auction is conducted under lawful territorial labor statutes," Holloway announced. His voice was measured, even the voice of a man accustomed to saying things that sounded official. "All transactions recorded and registered." Opening the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The men watched the platform with a collective blankness that Elias recognized as the practiced expression of people who had decided not to feel anything about what they were doing here. Then the door at the back of the platform opened, and a deputy, Elias didn't recognize, led a young woman out. She was perhaps 18. Lakota from her features and the style of what remained of her clothing, a deerskin dress worn and travel-stained, the hem frayed. Her wrists were locked in iron cuffs that had rusted red at the edges. Her feet were bare on the cold dirt floor. Her hair was black and long, falling across one cheek like a shield she had learned to carry. She did not look at the men in the barn. She looked somewhere else, not at the floor, not at the walls, but through them at something only she could see. Her face was still. Not the stillness of fear, though fear must have lived somewhere inside her. The stillness of a person who had decided that the men in this room were not worth the dignity of her attention. "Contracted laborer," Holloway announced. "No family, no registered documentation. Opening bid $5. Silence. One of the ranchers near the front spat into the dirt. "Don't know if she can work," he muttered. Someone else said something about Indians not taking orders. The murmuring passed around the room like a slow wave, careless and dismissive. The way men talked about livestock they weren't sure of. $3? Holloway tried. Still nothing. Elias had stopped writing in his notepad. He wasn't sure exactly when. He was looking at the woman on the platform, at the curtain of black hair across her cheek, at the rust-red cuffs on her wrists, at the particular quality of stillness in her posture that was not submission and was not defeat, but was something harder and more permanent than either. Then the wind came through. It found the gaps in the old barn walls and moved through the interior in a single slow current, lifting dust from the floor, stirring the hair of the men nearest the walls. It reached the woman on the platform and lifted the thin chain around her neck, and the pendant at its end swung outward into the light. A feather, eagle from the size and shape of it, bound at the base with red thread. Small and worn and unmistakably deliberate, a thing made with care, carried with intention. Elias stopped breathing. He had seen that feather before. Not one like it. That one. The specific worn angle of the binding. The particular shade of the red thread, the way the feather caught light and held it. He had seen these things before, 8 years ago, in the dark and the smoke and the orange roar of the fire on the neck of a child who had looked up at him with a specific expression that he had spent 8 years trying not to see in his sleep. "Help me, please." $30. His own voice, coming from him, loud in the silence of the barn. Every man in the building turned to look at him. Holloway blinked. $30 was more than 6 times the opening price. It was an absurd number for a transaction like this, the kind of number that raised questions, the kind of number that drew attention. Everything Elias had spent 8 years avoiding. He did not take it back. Holloway looked at him for a moment, then at the woman on the platform. She had finally turned her head not toward Elias, not toward anyone in the barn, but slightly upward as though she had heard something far away. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, a murmur in Lakota that Elias couldn't hear from where he stood, low and soft, and entirely private. Holloway raised his gavel. Sold. They left Bozeman in the mid-morning, the sun higher, now the day warming toward the particular dry heat of a Montana spring that could turn cold again without warning. Elias rode with the woman sitting behind him on the horse, her wrists still cuffed. He hadn't had a chance to remove them in the barn, and he hadn't wanted to draw more attention by doing it in the street. Neither of them spoke. He was aware of her behind him with a hypervigilance that had nothing to do with danger. She was light on the horse, her posture carefully arranged so that she maintained as much distance from him as the saddle allowed. She did not hold on to him. She balanced on her own. 3 miles out of Bozeman, where the road crested a low hill and the town disappeared behind them and the prairie opened in every direction like an exhalation. Elias reined the horse to a stop. He dismounted, reached into his coat, and found the small key the deputy had sold him along with the paperwork and additional $1, the man had said, with the flat effect of someone who had conducted this transaction many times. He turned to the woman and held up the key without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. Her eyes were dark, very dark, with a quality of attention in them that he found difficult to hold. Not hostile exactly, measuring. The eyes of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly and accurately because inaccuracy had consequences. He stepped forward and unlocked the left cuff. Then the right. The moment the iron fell away, she pulled both hands back against her chest, a sharp reflexive motion, pressing her wrists against her ribs. She looked at the marks on her skin, red bands where the metal had sat, then at him, then at the horizon in each direction. He could see the calculation happening. Distance to the tree line, speed of the horse. Which way was north? Elias stepped back and turned toward the horse. "I didn't buy you to put you to work," he said to the animal rather than to her. "I bought you to get you out of that room. You want to go, go. I won't stop you." Silence. Wind across the grass. "You're not going to tell me your name," she said. Her English was accented but precise, the grammar of someone who had learned the language carefully and used it with deliberate accuracy. "Elias," he said. "Elias Carn." Another silence. Then, "Why did you pay $30? He turned back around. She was watching him with the same measuring quality, but something had shifted in it. A new element had entered the calculation. He should have said something simple, because no one else was going to. Because I needed a worker. Because I had the money. Any of those would have been plausible. Any of those would have moved them past this moment without opening anything up. Instead, he looked at the feather pendant on her neck, swaying slightly in the wind. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Her hand came up and touched it, a gesture so automatic it looked like reflex. She looked at him with a new sharpness, and he understood that he had said exactly the wrong thing or exactly the right one, depending on which direction wrong and right were pointing. "It was my mother's," she said carefully. "She gave it to me before she died." "When did she die?" The measuring quality in her eyes intensified. "Why do you ask?" Elias didn't answer. He was looking at the feather and seeing another feather, identical in every detail, swinging in firelight against a child's collarbone. He was hearing a voice he had spent 8 years burying under the noise of movement and work and carefully maintained numbness. "Help me, please." He turned back to the horse. His hands, he noticed, were not quite steady on the reins. "There's a ranch about 5 miles north," he said. "Small place. I work there. You can stay there tonight if you want, decide where you're going in the morning." He mounted and settled into the saddle and did not look at her again. After a moment, she climbed up behind him with the same careful distance as before, and the horse moved forward into the open land. Her name she told him eventually when the ranch came into view on the horizon, and something in the long silence seemed to call for words to fill it, was Saya. He said nothing, filed it away, carried it carefully. The ranch was modest by any measure: a main cabin, a barn, a small corral, a root cellar dug into the hillside. It had belonged to a man named Garrett, who had gone back east 3 years ago and left Elias with the caretaking arrangement and a modest wage for maintenance. It was the longest Elias had stayed anywhere since leaving his father's service. He showed Saya the small storage room beside the barn, clean dry with a cot and a blanket. He brought water from the pump and a plate of cold cornbread from the cabin. She took the water but set it on the floor beside her and did not drink. She looked at the room, then at him standing in the doorway. "Officer's son," she said. The plate almost went to the floor. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was not anger and was not grief. Something colder and more complex than either the expression of someone confronting a fact they have known for a long time and have not yet decided what to do with. "How do you know that?" he said. Not a question, a statement. "I know your face," she said. "I have known your face for 8 years. I saw it the moment you spoke in that barn." The evening light came through the small window behind her, laying a stripe of pale gold across the floor between them. Outside, a night bird called once and went silent. "You were there," he said. "I was 10 years old," she said. "I was running. The lodges were burning. The men from the militia were driving everyone toward the center of the village." She paused. "I saw you standing at the edge of the firelight. You were young. You looked frightened. I thought—" She stopped. Something moved across her face and was controlled. "I thought you might help me." The air in the room felt different, heavier, like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time had finally been released into the open. "I reached for you," she said. "I said help me. Do you remember?" Elias looked at the floor. "Yes. What did you do?" The question sat in the silence and did not ask to be made smaller. "I turned away," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression and did not try to. He had no right to ask her face for anything right now. "You were afraid," she said at last. "Yes." "You were comfortable," she said. "There is a difference." He had no answer for that. There was no answer for it. She was right, and the rightness of it went down through him like cold water to a depth he hadn't known was there. She picked up the water cup and finally drank slowly, looking at the wall. When she set it down, she said, "I am staying only until I choose to walk away." "All right," he said. He pulled the door closed and stood outside in the last light of the evening, and the iron cuffs were still in his coat pocket. He had carried them without realizing, all the way from Bozeman, and the weight of them pressed against his ribs like an accusation he hadn't put into words yet. He didn't sleep. He sat at the table in the main cabin with the candle burning low and his father's trunk open on the floor beside him. He hadn't opened it since the old man's death 2 years ago. He had meant to go through it eventually. There were documents in there, property records, correspondence, but eventually had kept sliding forward, and the trunk had sat untouched through 2 winters. He opened it now because the woman in the storage room had said, "Officer's son," and the words had unlocked something in him, some door he had kept shut through sheer force of will, and now that it was open, he needed to know what was behind it. The trunk smelled of old leather and cold smoke, and something else underneath the faint chemical scent of old ink. His father's scent in a way. The colonel had always smelled of ink and tobacco and the particular dry dustiness of official papers. Field maps, campaign journals, letters in his father's cramped, precise handwriting. Elias sorted through them without reading, looking for something he couldn't name, some explanation for the shape of the thing he had lived inside his whole life. He found the forged treaty near the bottom. He recognized what it was, immediately had seen enough official documents to know the format, the structure of a federal agreement, but the content took him longer to process. The language was dense and bureaucratic, the kind of writing designed to be technically accurate while meaning something other than what it appeared to mean. He read it twice, then a third time. It declared that the Red Elk Band of the Lakota Nation had willingly relinquished their land claims in the Ash Creek Valley, signed by Wade Holloway, Lieutenant, Montana Territorial Militia, signed by Marcus Carn, Colonel, Montana Territorial Militia, signed by E. Carn, him, his own signature, 17 years old, a formality his father had said, just a procedure, standard paperwork sign here at the bottom. He had signed without reading. He had trusted his father with the way he trusted men trust institutions, not through belief, but through the exhaustion of continuous doubt. He stared at his name on the paper for a very long time. Then he found the other document. It was beneath the treaty, folded into a separate envelope, a battered government-issue envelope that had been opened and resealed more than once. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dense with figures and symbols he didn't immediately understand. A map of some kind. Geographic. The Ash Creek Valley was outlined in the upper quadrant, and across it a series of markings that meant nothing to him. Notations in a technical shorthand he didn't recognize. He folded the map and put it in his coat pocket without knowing exactly why. Something in the specificity of it, the care with which the notations had been made, told him it mattered. He would figure out what it meant later. He kept searching. Near the very bottom of the trunk, tucked beneath a water-damaged field journal, he found a letter. His father's handwriting. Not addressed to Elias, addressed to Holloway. It was dated 3 years ago, a year before the colonel's death. Wade. The boy has signed. He doesn't know what he signed. Keep it that way. He's useful as long as he stays ignorant and harmless. If he ever starts asking questions, and he won't, he's too busy keeping his head down, remind him of his own name on the document. That should be sufficient. He is not to know about Ashford. He is not to know about the survey. When this is finished, the whole matter closes, and we are all better off. MC Elias read the letter. Read it again. Set it on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely reliable. He doesn't know what he signed. He sat with that for a long time. The candle burned lower. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, a sound like breathing. He had been used. That much was clear. His father had handed him a pen and pointed to a line, and he had signed his name to something that had killed people. He had been 17. He had not known. These were facts. They did not make the people less dead. He is not to know about Ashford. The name meant nothing to him. He filed it away alongside the map in his coat pocket and the treaty on the table, and the weight of everything he was beginning to understand he had been carrying without knowing its name. He heard the knock on the door just as the candle guttered and went dark. He opened the door with his hand on the revolver at his hip. The man outside was not wearing a deputy's badge. He was wearing ordinary clothes, dark coat-work trousers, boots that had covered a lot of ground. His hat was pulled low despite the dark. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had started weathered and had only gotten more so, and the posture of someone who had learned to make themselves smaller than their actual size. Samuel Briggs, Holloway's deputy, not wearing his badge, not carrying his rifle, not presenting himself as any kind of official. "Mr. Carn," he said quietly. Elias kept his hand on the revolver. "You've got about 30 seconds to tell me what you want before I make a decision about whether to let you keep standing there." Briggs nodded as though this was a reasonable response. "I'm not here about the girl," he said. "I'm not here on Holloway's behalf. I came on my own." "Why?" Briggs looked past Elias into the dark cabin, then at the storage room beside the barn, where a faint line of candlelight showed under the door. He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much to give up. "I know who she is," he said at last. "I know her father was the chief of the Red Elk Band. I know what he carried with him when he died." He paused. "And I know where it is." Elias studied him. "How do you know any of that?" Briggs was silent for another moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but stripped of something, some protective layer that had been serving as a buffer between the words and the thing they described. "Before I was Holloway's deputy," he said, "I was a translator for the Lakota at the treaty negotiations 1869. He looked at the ground. "I translated her father's words into English for the federal representative. I heard every promise that was made. I watched every signature go down." He stopped. "And then," Elias said, "and then I was told to forget what I'd heard." Briggs met his eyes. "I was told that if I remembered it out loud, my family would find out I'd been helping the Lakota negotiate against territorial interests. I had a wife, a child." He exhaled through his nose. "I told myself it was the only choice." The night was very still around them. "What happened to your family?" Elias said. "My wife left 2 years later," Briggs said flatly. "Took the child. Said she couldn't live with the shape of me." He shrugged once, a small defeated movement. Turned out the thing I was protecting wasn't worth protecting after all. Elias looked at him for a long time. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back. Briggs came inside. He stood in the middle of the dark cabin and said, "Her father hid the real treaty before he died. The actual federal document, government seal, legitimate signatures proof that the Red Elk Band had legal claim to Ash Creek Valley. He gave it to a soldier he trusted, someone he believed might keep it safe. I know who that soldier was." He paused. "I've been waiting 8 years for someone to come along who had a reason to use it." "Why me?" Elias said. "Why now?" Briggs looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. "Because you paid $30 for her in a barn where everyone else was pretending she wasn't a person," he said. "And because your name is on that treaty in the trunk over there, and that means you've got a stake in this whether you want one or not." Elias looked at the trunk, at the letter on the table, at the treaty with his signature. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Nothing yet," Briggs said. He moved toward the door. "I just wanted you to know I'm not entirely what I appear to be." He paused in the doorway. "Neither are you, I think." He left. His footsteps faded into the dark, and then there was only the wind in the cottonwoods and the thin line of candlelight under the storage room door, and Elias standing in his father's cabin with his father's papers spread across the table, and the growing understanding that the life he had constructed around silence and motion was about to come apart at every seam. He sat down, put his head in his hands. Outside Montana went on being enormous and indifferent in the dark the way it always had. He told her in the morning, not everything, not all at once. He started with the treaty, laid it on the table in front of her with his signature facing up, and let her read it herself. He watched her face as she read, looking for something he couldn't name. What he saw was a quality of stillness that reminded him of the woman on the platform the day before. Not surprise, not horror, but a deep and practiced form of recognition, the expression of someone encountering a fact they had suspected for a long time and are finally seeing confirmed in writing. She set the paper down, looked at his signature. "You were 17, she said. "That doesn't change what's written there." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She looked up at him. "Did you know what you were signing?" "My father told me it was a formality." He heard the smallness of this as he said it. "I didn't read it." She was quiet for a moment. "You were lied to," she said. "By the man who was supposed to protect you." "The people in that valley were supposed to be protected by the United States government," he said. "That didn't save them." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the treaty. "My father told me that before he died, he gave something to someone for safekeeping," she said. "A document. The real treaty. The one that said our land was ours." She paused. "I've been looking for it for 2 years. Briggs might know where it is," Elias said. She looked at him sharply. He told her about the night visit. Everything Briggs had said, the translation work, the silence, the family, the 8-year wait. He watched her face as he spoke and saw the calculation running behind her eyes, the same rapid and accurate assessment she had applied to him from the beginning. "Do you believe him?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I don't think he came here to help Holloway. If he wanted to help Holloway, he would have brought more men." She thought about this. Outside the morning was brightening, the light coming gold and level across the grass. The horses in the corral moved slowly in the early warmth. "There's something else," Elias said. He took the map from his coat pocket and put it on the table beside the treaty. She looked at it. He watched her try to read the notations and see the same blankness he had seen technical shorthand, a specialized language. "I found it in my father's trunk," he said. "I don't know what the symbols mean, but it covers the same area as the treaty, the Ash Creek Valley." Saya studied the map for a long time without speaking. "My father used to say the valley held more than grass and water," she said finally. Her voice was careful, moving around something larger than what she was naming. "He said the earth there had a weight to it underground, a richness." She looked up. "The elders called it sleeping metal." Elias said nothing. The map sat between them on the table with its careful, deliberate notations, and outside the morning light moved across the grass of a valley that had been burned and emptied 8 years ago, and something in the shape of things was beginning to clarify in a way that made his chest tight. He didn't understand the map yet, but he kept it. He kept it in his coat pocket through everything that came after without knowing exactly why. The way you keep a thing you can't name but know you'll need. The afternoon had gone copper and long when the riders appeared on the road. Elias was splitting wood at the side of the cabin when he heard the hooves. He set the axe down and came around to the front yard and stood there with his hands at his sides as 3 horses came up the road in a small dust cloud, and Holloway pulled up at the edge of the yard with his coat flaring and his pale eyes moving over the property with the casual authority of a man who has never been asked to justify his presence anywhere. "Afternoon, Carn," Holloway said. He was smiling the way he always smiled, the expression arriving before any feeling to support it. "Came to make sure you understand the terms of your purchase yesterday." "I understand them fine," Elias said. "I paid $30. She's free." Holloway reached into his coat and produced a folded document, the seal visible from where Elias stood. "You paid for temporary custody," he said pleasantly. "Not release. There's a distinction in territorial law. The girl reverts to the territory after 48 hours unless a proper release contract is filed." He tilted his head. "Which you haven't done." "Then I'll file it." "The filing office is closed until Monday." He said this with the satisfied delivery of a man who has arranged exactly this inconvenience. "In the meantime, she comes back to town with me." Elias looked at him, not at the badge, not at the document, at the face. He was 38, maybe 40. The lines around his eyes were deep. The way he held himself on the horse, the particular set of his shoulders, the angle of his chin was familiar in a way that had been sitting in the back of Elias's recognition since yesterday without finding a name. And then it found one. The night of the fire. The officers of the militia standing at the edge of the firelight, young men in a row watching the lodges burn. His father at the center. And, beside his father, a younger version of this face 20 years stripped from it, bright with something that wasn't quite pride, but occupied the same territory. The lieutenant who had stood with his father and watched Ash Creek burn. Holloway held the document and smiled his smile and waited. "You're not taking her?" Elias said. Something moved through Holloway's expression, not quite surprise, but a recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has encountered an unexpected variable. He studied Elias for a moment with those pale eyes. "You know," he said quietly, leaning forward slightly in the saddle, "I knew your father. Good man. Understood how the world worked." He paused. "You should think carefully about whether you want to be standing where you're standing." "I know where I'm standing," Elias said. Holloway held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he tucked the document back into his coat and gathered his reins. "Monday, then," he said pleasantly. "We'll sort it out through the proper channels." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good afternoon." He turned his horse and rode, his 2 deputies falling in behind him, and the dust from their horses drifted slowly across the yard in the still air. Elias stood and watched them go until the road was empty. He didn't know about the telegraph office yet. He didn't know that Holloway would stop there on the way back to town, and that a message would go out that evening to an address in Helena, and that 8 words would come back before nightfall. "Handle it clean. No witnesses. No paper trail. A." He didn't know any of that yet. But standing in the yard with the dust settling around him and the feeling of something irrevocable having begun, he understood that the 48 hours of distance he had maintained between himself and every consequence of his history had just collapsed to 0. He was in this now. He turned and went inside to tell Saya what was coming. Holloway came back the next morning. Not Monday, not through proper channels. He came with 6 riders at dawn when the light was still thin and grey and the dew sat heavy on the grass, and Elias heard the hooves while the coffee was still heating on the stove. He was at the window before the sound fully registered. 6 horses. Holloway in front, his coat dark against the pale sky. His deputies fanned out behind him in a line that was less about practicality and more about the message a line of armed men sends when they arrive at your door before sunrise. Elias pulled on his coat, checked the revolver, went outside. Saya was already standing at the corner of the barn. She had heard them too. She stood with her arms at her sides and watched the riders approach with the same still attention she had given everything since he had known her, measuring, assessing, deciding. Holloway pulled up at the yard's edge, He was not smiling this time. "Morning, Carn." His voice had lost its pleasantness from the day before. What remained was the thing underneath the pleasantness, harder, flatter, the voice of a man who has decided to stop performing patience. "I've had some communication from Helena since yesterday. The terms of your purchase have been reviewed. Temporary custody has been revoked." "On whose authority?" Elias said. Holloway reached into his coat and produced a paper. Even from 10 feet away, Elias could see the official seal. "Territorial authority," Holloway said, "countersigned by a Helena magistrate." He looked past Elias at Saya. "She comes with me now. You can file whatever complaint you like through the proper office." Elias did not move from the doorway. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. The horses were restless in the early cold, their breath making small clouds in the morning air. "Walk away from this," Holloway said quietly. Not a threat, almost a suggestion. "Your father was a practical man, Elias. He understood that some arrangements exist because they need to exist, and the men who maintain them are not the villains of the story, they are the men who understand how the world actually functions." He paused. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Elias looked at him. At the face he had placed the night before, the young lieutenant at the edge of the firelight, bright with something not quite pride. "I already am," he said. Something shifted in Holloway's expression. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What remained was assessment, the calculation of a man determining how much force the situation required. "Last chance," Holloway said. "You're not taking her," Elias said. Holloway held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not in agreement, but in the particular way of a man filing information away for later use. "You've made your position clear," he said. He gathered his reins. "So have I." He turned his horse and rode, his deputies falling in around him, and the sound of the hooves faded down the road and disappeared into the morning. Elias stood in the yard and felt the silence that followed settle over him like something being lowered into place. Saya came to stand beside him. She looked at the road where the riders had gone. "He won't stop," she said. "I know. He has the law behind him, or what passes for it here." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you doing this?" He looked at her. "Because I owe you a debt I can't pay by walking away a second time." She held his gaze. Whatever she made of that answer, she kept to herself. She turned and went back toward the barn, and Elias went inside to look at the papers on the table and think about what came next. He found the telegraph message that afternoon. He had ridden into Bozeman carefully by the back road, leaving Saya at the ranch with the door barred and the revolver he could spare on the table beside her. He needed to know the shape of what Holloway had built, and the shape of things could sometimes be read in the gaps between what was visible. The telegraph operator was a nervous young man named Cord, who owed Elias a favor from a winter 2 years ago when Elias had helped dig his wagon out of a drift. Cord did not work for Holloway exactly, but he worked in the same building, and information moved through that building the way water moved through rock, slowly, inevitably finding every crack. Cord met him at the side door and slid a folded paper into his hand without looking at him. "I shouldn't be doing this," Cord said. "I know," Elias said. "Thank you." He read it on the road back, walking the horse slowly through the afternoon light. The message was from Helena, addressed to Holloway, sent yesterday evening 2 hours after Holloway had left the ranch, to Sheriff W. Holloway, Bozeman, Montana Territory, from R. Ashford Northern Iron Line Company. Handle it clean. No witnesses. No paper trail. The rail cannot wait. 8 words in the middle. Elias read them twice. No witnesses. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket next to the map. R. Ashford. The name from his father's letter. He is not to know about Ashford. And now Ashford was sending telegrams to Holloway about clean handling and witnesses and a railroad that could not wait. The pieces were beginning to connect in a way that made his chest tight. He rode back to the ranch in the lengthening afternoon and found Saya at the table reading his father's field journal. She looked up when he came in, and he could see from her expression that she had found something. "Your father kept records of everything," she said. She was not accusing, simply stating. "Yes. He wrote about the night of the fire." She held the journal toward him. Page 43. He took it, read. His father's handwriting cramped and precise. The entry was dated 3 days after the attack on Ash Creek. It described the operation in the language of military procedure objectives. Execution outcome. The lodges had been destroyed, resistance had been minimal, the territory had been secured for settlement, and at the bottom a single line that the military language could not quite contain. The survey results confirmed. The valley is viable. Ashford satisfied. Elias set the journal on the table, the map in his pocket, the survey, the sleeping metal Saya's father had spoken of. He thought of the notations on the map, the careful, deliberate markings across the Ash Creek Valley, and understood for the first time what he was looking at. "There's something under the valley," he said. Saya looked at him. "I know. You knew. My father knew. He told me the earth there was heavy with it. He didn't use your words for it. But yes." She looked at the table. "The elders said the valley had been given to us not only for the grass and the water, but for what lay below. That it was a responsibility as much as a gift." She paused. "I didn't understand what that meant until I was older, until I started to understand why we had been killed for it." Elias took the telegraph message from his pocket and put it on the table beside the journal. She read it, set it down with the particular careful gentleness she had used the day before with the treaty. The gesture of someone putting down something too hot to hold for long. No witnesses. "This man Ashford," she said. "He was there the night of the fire. I don't know yet, but his name is in my father's papers. And he's running a railroad company that wants to go through Ash Creek Valley." He paused. "There are veins of silver under that land. I think there have been since before any of this started." The word silver sat in the air between them. Saya looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was going amber, the long Montana shadows stretching across the grass. "My father said the earth had a weight to it," she said again, quieter this time. "I thought he meant significance, something spiritual." She stopped. He might have meant something else entirely. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Saya said, "We need to move. Holloway will come back tonight or tomorrow with more men and better paperwork, and we will not be able to stop him through argument." "Where do we go?" "Helena," she said. "There's a federal marshal there. If the treaty is what Briggs says it is, if my father's document is real and legitimate, then a federal marshal has jurisdiction that Holloway doesn't." Elias looked at the papers spread across the table, the forged treaty, his father's journal, the telegraph message, the map. "We take all of it," he said. "Yes." He began to gather the documents. She went to the storage room to pack what little she had. He could hear her moving through the wall, quiet, efficient, without wasted motion. He stopped with the journal in his hands. His father had written 43 pages of careful records about an operation that had killed dozens of people, so that a railroad company could run tracks over a silver deposit. His father had handed his 17-year-old son a pen and pointed to a line and said, "Sign here. It's just a formality." And his son had signed, and the people in the valley had died, and his father had written about it in the cramped, precise handwriting of a man completing a task. Ashford satisfied. He put the journal in the bag with everything else. That evening, after the packing was done and the horses were prepared and the last of the daylight was fading from the sky, they sat at the table. Elias had lit one candle. It stood between them, small and steady, in the still air of the cabin. Saya was working on the feather pendant. The binding at the base had begun to fray. He had noticed it swinging looser on its chain in the last day, the red thread worn thin at the edges. She had found a needle and thread from somewhere, and now she sat at her end of the table with the pendant in her hands and worked at it with slow, careful movements, rethreading the binding, pulling the thread tight with small, precise tugs. Elias sat at his end of the table and looked at his hands. His right hand, the one that had held the pen. He turned it over and looked at the palm calloused from years of fencing and carpentry and hauling, the skin roughened and darkened, the hand of someone who had spent 8 years in physical labor. Someone who had spent 8 years trying to become a different person through work. The hand that had signed his name. The hand that had pulled away from a child's grip. He looked at it for a long time without moving. The candle burned. Saya's needle moved through the thread in small, quiet arcs. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek. The sound of it like breathing, like the land respiring in the dark. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would change the shape of what they were both carrying. There was no arrangement of words that would make his signature mean something different, or bring back what the fire had taken, or give either of them a version of the last 8 years they could inhabit more comfortably than the ones they had. So they sat in the silence and let it be what it was. After a long time, Saya finished with the pendant. She held it up, checking the binding tight now, even the red thread replaced and secure. She looked at it in the candlelight for a moment. Then she set it on the table between them. Not around her neck. On the table in the middle, in the space between where he sat and where she sat. She set it down the way you set down something you are not discarding, but are not in this moment able to carry. Elias looked at it. The candle burned lower. He did not reach for it. It was not his to reach for, but he sat with it there between them until the flame guttered and went out, and in the dark he could still see the shape of it, small and worn and carefully repaired, a thing that had survived being carried through fire. Holloway came for them in the morning. They were already mounted when the riders appeared at the far end of the road, 6 of them coming fast, a small cloud of dust rising in the early light. Briggs was among them. Elias could see his silhouette at the back of the group, slightly separate from the others, riding with his rifle across his saddle in a way that was technically standard and somehow off. North, Elias said. They rode. The first miles were open country, rolling grass, scattered stands of pine, the land still cold and shadowless in the early morning. Their horse was good, but carrying 2, and Holloway's riders were gaining ground. Elias could hear the pursuit behind them, the rhythm of the hoofbeats growing closer, and he pushed the horse harder and thought about the terrain ahead. The Bridger Range was 20 miles north. There were passes through it. He knew 2 of them. One was faster, one was safer. In his experience, these were never the same pass. "They're going to cut us off," Saya said. Her voice was calm, the calm of someone thinking clearly under pressure. "Not if we reach the canyon first." "What canyon?" "Red Rock. Narrow. One way through." He glanced back. The riders were perhaps half a mile behind now and closing. "If we get through before they do, we gain 3 miles on them at least." "And if they get there first?" He didn't answer that. They rode hard through the morning, the land rising gradually as they moved toward the mountains, the grass giving way to scrub pine and then to denser forest as the elevation climbed. The air thinned and cooled. The hoofbeats behind them remained constant, not gaining now, but not falling back either. Holloway's riders pacing themselves for a longer pursuit. Red Rock Canyon appeared ahead of them as a crack in the grey stone of the ridge, the entrance barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. Elias pushed through at speed, the rock walls rising on either side, the sound of their horses' hooves suddenly loud and echoing in the narrow space. The canyon wound for perhaps half a mile, tight curves, loose rock underfoot, places where the walls pressed close enough to brush both stirrups at once. Elias had ridden it twice before and remembered enough of it to move without hesitating. They were 2/3 through when he heard the sound ahead. Hoofbeats, coming toward them from the far end. He pulled up hard. The horse skidded on loose gravel, catching itself at the edge of a drop where the path narrowed to a ledge. Behind them, the sound of Holloway's riders entering the canyon. Ahead, riders blocking the far exit. Trapped. Saya said nothing. He could feel her go very still behind him, not frozen, but gathered the stillness of someone collecting themselves before a decision. "There's only one way out," she said quietly. "I see it," he said, though he didn't yet. The riders ahead came around the last curve, 3 men rifles already raised. At the same moment, Holloway's group came into view behind them. Holloway at the front, his pale eyes moving over the situation with satisfaction. "Road ends here, Carn," Holloway called. His voice bounced off the canyon walls, coming from everywhere at once. Elias kept his hand away from his revolver. 6 men plus Holloway rifles out. The math was not favorable. Then a shot cracked from behind him. Not at him. Not at Saya. The bullet hit the canyon wall 6 inches from Holloway's face, exploding a burst of rock fragments into his eyes. Holloway reeled back with a curse, his horse lurching sideways. In the split second of chaos, Holloway blinded his deputies, reacting to their leader, the riders ahead uncertain. Elias drove his heels hard into the horse's flanks. The animal lunged forward. A gap had opened between the riders ahead, whether by design or by the sudden commotion behind them, and they drove through it. The horse's shoulder catching the edge of one rider's stirrup, sending the man sideways, and then they were past, and the canyon's far exit was opening ahead of them, and the air rushed past in a cold stream. Behind them, shouting. Another shot wild ricocheting off stone somewhere above them. Then they were out. The canyon opened onto a wide pine-forested slope, and they rode into it, and the trees swallowed them, and the sound of the pursuit fell behind and then away. Elias slowed the horse gradually, letting it find its footing on the forest floor, its sides heaving. He looked back through the trees. Nothing visible, nothing moving. He looked down at his hands. Steady. He was somewhat surprised by this. "That shot," Saya said. "The first one, it wasn't aimed at us." "No. It came from behind Holloway, from his own group." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Briggs." "Yes." She took this in. He could feel her thinking the same careful assessment she applied to everything, running the variables, checking the angles. "He's been waiting," she said, "not just for someone to use the treaty, for a moment when it mattered enough to act." Elias nodded. He reached into his saddlebag and checked the documents, all still there, wrapped in the oilcloth. The map, the forged treaty, his father's journal, the telegraph message. Then he heard something crashing through the brush to their right and brought his hand to his revolver, but it was a single horse, and the man on it was riding with one hand pressed to his shoulder and his hat gone. Briggs pulled up beside them. His face was white under the weathering. Blood showed dark through the fingers pressed to his shoulder, not a serious wound from the look of it, but real. "Fell in the confusion," he said shortly, not offering details. He reached into his coat with his good arm and produced a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, heavier than it looked, the cloth dark with age. He held it towards Saya. She looked at it. "Take it," he said. "I've carried it long enough." She took it, unwrapped it slowly, her fingers careful on the aged cloth, peeling back the layers to reveal the document inside. Elias watched her face as she read. He had seen her hold herself still through everything, the auction, the recognition, the signing, the flight. He had watched her maintain a quality of controlled composure that he had come to understand was not distance, but discipline. The practiced stillness of someone who cannot afford to come apart. Now something moved through her face that was not composure and was not its opposite. Something that did not have a clean name. Her fingers pressed flat against the paper, against the seal, the signatures, the words that her father had died believing would matter. She breathed in once, deep and slow. "This is it," she said, very quietly, to herself or to the document or to her father, not to either of the men with her. Briggs looked at the forest floor. "Your father trusted a soldier named Hadley with it the night of the attack. Hadley gave it to me 3 days later. Said he didn't know what it was, but it felt important, and he was too frightened to hold it." He paused. "Hadley died of fever that winter. Nobody else knew I had it." "Why didn't you come forward?" Elias asked. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. "Because I told myself the right moment hadn't come. That coming forward without enough evidence would just get me killed and the document destroyed." He looked at his hands. "Mostly I was just afraid. And afraid men find a lot of good reasons to stay afraid." Nobody said anything about that. The forest was quiet around them, pine and wind and the distant sound of a creek somewhere below. Whatever Holloway was doing in the canyon, it hadn't reached them yet. "We ride for Helena," Saya said. She rewrapped the treaty in its oilcloth and held it against her chest. "Tonight." Briggs nodded. He wasn't going back to Bozeman. They all understood this without discussing it. "Can you ride?" Elias asked him. "I've ridden worse." He pressed his coat against his shoulder. "Let's go before they regroup." They moved deeper into the trees, heading north, and the canyon was somewhere behind them and Bozeman somewhere behind that. And ahead of them was 100 miles of hard country and whatever waited at the end of it. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening and made camp when the horses needed rest in a hollow between 2 ridges where the wind didn't reach and the firelight wouldn't carry far. Briggs cleaned his wound with water from the creek and wrapped it with cloth Elias cut from the blanket roll. It was a graze deeper than a scratch, but not dangerous if it didn't fester. He moved his arm experimentally and winced, but didn't make a sound about it. They ate cold provisions, cornbread, dried meat, water, and sat in the small warmth of a fire built low enough to be careful. Saya held the treaty in her lap, not reading it, just holding it. "Tell me about my father," she said to Briggs. He looked at her across the fire. What do you want to know what he was like in the room when he was negotiating? She paused. I was 10. I saw him as my father. I want to know what he was like as a man doing something that mattered. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, he was patient, he said. Quieter than I expected. The federal representative Ashford was used to negotiations where he set the terms and the other party accepted them. Your father didn't work that way. He listened to everything. He asked questions. He made Ashford explain each clause in plain language before he would agree to translate it for the other elders. A pause. Ashford was irritated. He kept trying to rush the process. Your father wouldn't be rushed. Saya looked at the fire. At the end, Briggs continued, when the treaty was signed and the ceremony was done, your father said something in Lakota that I didn't translate fully. Ashford asked what he said. I told him it was a blessing. He stopped. What did he actually say? Saya asked. Briggs looked at her. He said, we are trusting you with something that cannot be replaced. Do not make us into fools for having trusted you. The fire made small sounds. The wind moved through the pines above them. He knew, she said. I think he hoped he was wrong, Briggs said, and I think he wanted to say it aloud either way, so that someone had heard it. Elias looked at the dark beyond the fire. He thought about his father, about the journal entry, Ashford satisfied, written 3 days after the fire, in the cramped, precise handwriting of a man completing a transaction. He tried to find in the shape of that sentence something that resembled regret or hesitation or awareness of the human weight of what had been done. He could not find it. The fire burned lower. Briggs fell asleep against his saddle, his wounded arm across his chest. Saya put the treaty back in its oilcloth and lay down with it beside her, her hand resting on it even in sleep. Elias kept watch. The sky above the pines was enormous and cold and very clear, the stars sharp as cut glass. Montana sky. He had always lived under it, even when he was elsewhere in his mind. It had always been too big to ignore. He sat with his back against a pine and thought about what waited in Helena and what it would mean to say all of it out loud in front of someone with the authority to do something about it. He thought about his name on the forged treaty. He had been used. That was true. He had been 17 and ignorant and had trusted the wrong person. That was also true, but he had also been there. He had stood at the edge of the firelight and a child had reached for him and he had turned away. No document required for that one. No signature. Just a boy making a choice in the space of a second that he would carry for 8 years and longer. He looked at Saya sleeping with her hand on the treaty her father had died for. He had not saved her 8 years ago. He had not even tried. But he was here now, and she was here, and the documents were in the bag, and the 100 miles to Helena were not yet behind them. He stayed awake until the first pale suggestion of dawn appeared in the east. Then he woke the others, and they saddled the horses in the grey early light, and they rode on. On the second day of riding, when they were deep enough into the foothills that Bozeman felt like a different world, Say came up alongside him on the narrow trail and rode in silence for a while. Then she said, "Last night I almost left." He looked at her. When Briggs was sleeping. "I thought about taking the treaty and the horse and going alone." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I have been alone for 2 years. I know how to move without being seen. I could have been 20 miles north before morning. Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I've seen what happens when one person carries the truth alone," she said. "My father carried it. He died with it in his hands and it nearly disappeared." She paused. "The truth needs more than one voice, or it becomes a story only one person tells, and single stories are easy to bury." Elias said nothing. "I don't trust you because you paid for me," she said. "I don't trust you because you feel guilty. I don't trust the system that will hear this case, or the men who will decide what to do with what we bring them." She looked at him then, directly, the dark eyes steady. "But I trust that you have reasons to see this through that have nothing to do with me, and right now, that is enough." Elias held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the trail. "My father took money," he said, "from Ashford, to burn your village, to clear the land for a railroad and a silver mine." He said it plainly without softening. He dressed it in military language and official documents and told himself it was necessary and correct. He handed me a pen and used my name as additional cover. He paused. "I'm not doing this to redeem him. I'm doing it because The only way to separate myself from what he did is to actively undo as much of it as I can. Saya listened. That probably sounds like a calculation, he said. No, she said. It sounds like honesty. She looked at the mountains rising ahead of them. Honesty is rarer than most people think. They rode on in silence, and above them the sky was vast and clear and moving toward the particular deep blue of high-altitude afternoon, and Helena was still a day away, and the truth was still something only they knew. But it was in the saddlebag. It was documented and sealed and real. And they were still riding toward the place where it needed to be heard. Helena arrived on the third morning. They came down out of the foothills as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the light going gold and level across the valley floor, and the territorial capital spread before them in the broad flat of the prickly pear valley. Low buildings and high ones, church steeples catching the early light, the permanent haze of coal smoke sitting over the rooftops like a grey shawl. The streets were already moving. Freight wagons, merchants opening shutters. The particular noise of a city that had decided it was a city and was proving it through constant motion. After 3 days of open country, it felt like an assault. Elias kept his hat low. Briggs rode with his wounded arm close to his body, his coat arranged to cover the blood-stained wrapping. Saya rode beside Elias and looked at the city with the careful attention she gave, everything, measuring it, reading it, deciding what it was. I've never been here, she said. It's smaller than it thinks it is, Elias said. They found the federal marshal's office on the main street, between a land registry and a dry goods store marked with a government seal above the door that had been painted recently enough to still be bright. Elias tied the horses at the rail and stood for a moment looking at the door. This was the moment everything either became something or became nothing. He pushed the door open and went inside. Marshal Garrett Voss was not what Elias had expected. He had expected a man shaped by authority, broad, deliberate, the physical presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. What he found was a man of perhaps 55 who sat behind a desk stacked with papers and looked like he had not slept adequately in several months. His hair was silver white and needed cutting. His eyes were sharp and deeply tired in equal measure, the eyes of someone who had been paying attention to things that most people were paid to ignore and had found the experience wearing. He looked up when they came in, looked at Elias, at Saya, at Briggs with his arm held carefully against his side. "Shut the door," he said. Elias shut it. Voss leaned back in his chair and looked at the three of them with the particular quality of assessment that Elias had come to associate with people who had spent their careers distinguishing between what people said and what was actually true. "You've come a long way," he said. "Sit down and tell me why." Elias put the saddlebag on the desk. He did not summarize. He did not explain in advance. He took the documents out one by one and laid them on the desk in the order. They told the story, the forged treaty first, then the real one, still in its oilcloth, then his father's journal opened to page 43, then the map with its careful notations, then the telegraph message. Handle it clean, no witnesses, no paper trail. Voss read each document slowly. He did not speak. He did not react visibly. He read with the focused stillness of someone who has learned that their face is a form of information and controls it accordingly. When he finished, he sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the arrangement of papers before him. "The survey," he said finally. "When was this conducted?" "Dated 1869, Elias said. "A year before the attack on Ash Creek." Voss nodded slowly. "We received reports about the Ash Creek incident in 1870, he said. "They described it as a response to treaty violations by the Red Elk Band." He paused. The reports were filed by Lieutenant Wade Holloway and countersigned by Colonel Marcus Carn. He looked at Elias. "Your father?" "Yes." "And you have documentation indicating both signatures were fraudulent in their representation of events. The treaty they cited as being violated was itself forged," Elias said. "The real treaty is there." He nodded toward the oilcloth document. "My father's journal entry confirms the survey preceded the attack. The attack was not a response to a violation. It was a land-clearing operation for a mining and railroad interest." Voss looked at the telegraph message. "R. Ashford," he said. "Northern Iron Line Company," Elias said. His name appears in my father's correspondence going back to 1868. He was the federal representative at the original treaty negotiations in 1869. He looked at Briggs. Briggs stepped forward. I was the translator at those negotiations, he said. I can testify to what was agreed to, what was promised, and what Ashford did afterward. Voss looked at him for a long moment. You're Holloway's deputy. I was, Briggs said. I won't be going back. Another silence. Voss stood. He moved to the window and looked out at the street for a moment, the freight wagons, the merchants, the ordinary motion of a city that did not know what was sitting on a desk 30 feet away. Then he turned back. Ashford is not a small problem, he said. He said it the way you state a fact about weather, something that exists independent of anyone's preference about it. He has been before the territorial legislature 3 times in the last 2 years, lobbying for the Northern Iron Line route. He has relationships in Washington. He has money, and he has patience, and he has spent 15 years building a position that is very difficult to attack directly. We're not attacking it directly, Saya said. Voss looked at her. It was the first time she had spoken in the office, and something in the quality of her voice, level precise, carrying the weight of everything she had not said, seemed to recalibrate his attention. The treaty is legitimate, she continued. It is a federal document with a federal seal and the signatures of a federal representative. If it is genuine, and it is, then everything built on top of its suppression is built on a crime. Not a territorial dispute, a federal crime. She paused. Ashford signed that treaty. His name is on it. And his name is on the order that had our people killed to bury it. Voss looked at the 2 documents side by side, the real treaty and the telegraph message. Ashford's name on both. One a promise, one an order to erase the evidence of the promise. He sat back down. I'll need time to verify the documents, he said. Cross-reference the seals, the signatures, the dates. He looked at Elias. Your father's journal is corroborating evidence, but it won't be sufficient on its own. The map will need to be authenticated by a surveyor. He paused. And I'll need your sworn testimonies, all 3 of you, written and signed. How long? Elias said. 2 days, maybe 3. Holloway knows we came here, Elias said. He'll have sent word ahead. Voss met his eyes. I know, he said. That's why you're not going to a hotel. He stood and reached for his coat. There's a room at the back of this building. You'll stay there until I've done what needs to be done. He looked at all 3 of them. Don't go into the street without telling me first. Don't speak to anyone about why you're here. And don't underestimate what we're dealing with. He paused at the door. Ashford has had people watched before, he said quietly. And people who were watching him have had accidents. He said this without drama, as a plain statement of the landscape they were operating in. We move carefully, and we move correctly, and we don't give him a moment to act first. He went out. Elias looked at the desk where the documents still lay spread out in the order of their telling. The map, the forged treaty, the real one, the journal, the telegraph message, 8 years of buried truth arranged on a federal marshal's desk in the morning light. He exhaled slowly. They were not finished. They were not safe. But something had shifted in the shape of the thing. It had moved from something carried privately in the dark to something laid out in daylight before a witness with the authority to act on it. That was not nothing. Voss worked quickly. On the first day, he compared the seals and signatures of both treaties against the Federal Registry, a process that required a telegraph to Washington and a 3-hour wait for the response. The response confirmed what the documents stated. The seal on the real treaty was genuine, registered in the federal record in 1869, and the signature of the federal representative matched the official signature of R. Ashford on file. The forged treaty's seal was a copy good enough to pass casual inspection, not good enough to survive comparison with the original registration. On the second day, Voss brought in a surveyor, a quiet, careful man who spread the map across the desk and spent an hour with it before looking up and saying in the flat voice of someone reporting a measurement, "Silver deposit, substantial. The survey is accurate and the vein markers are consistent with confirmed deposits in the surrounding range." He paused. This survey was conducted by a professional, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. On the third day, Voss took their sworn testimonies. Elias first, then Briggs, then Saya last. He wrote everything in a precise, unhurried hand, reading each section back before moving to the next, making corrections where the language needed to be more precise. When he reached Saya's testimony and she described the night of the fire, her age, the burning lodges, the people driven to the center of the village. Her father's face the last time she saw it, Voss wrote without looking up, and his pen moved at the same steady pace as before, and his face was controlled and professional. But his jaw was tight in a way it had not been during the earlier testimonies. When it was done, he set the pen down and sat back. "There's something else you should know," he said. He opened his desk drawer and produced an envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed, the corners soft with handling. A government issue envelope, the kind that moved through official channels by the thousands. He set it on the desk. "This arrived at this office 3 years ago," he said. "It was misfiled. I found it 6 months ago when I was reorganizing the archive." He paused. "I didn't know what it meant then. I do now." Elias looked at the envelope, at the handwriting on the front. His father's handwriting. He picked it up. His hands were steady. He was somewhat surprised by this. He opened it and took out the single sheet inside and read it. It was a confession. Not in those words, his father would never have used that word, but it was a systematic account of what had been agreed, to what had been done, and who had been involved. The names, the dates, the amounts of money that had changed hands, the survey, the forged treaty, the order that had gone out on the night of the fire. At the bottom, in the cramped and precise handwriting of a man who had spent his life producing official documents. "I am sending this because I am told I am dying, and I find that I am not able to die without having written it down. I do not ask for anything. I only ask that it be read." Elias read it twice. He set it on the desk. He looked at the wall behind Voss for a long moment, at the territorial map pinned there, the county lines, the rivers, the settlements. Ash Creek Valley was a small mark on it, unnamed somewhere in the western section. His father had been a man who dressed cruelty in official language and called it necessity, who had handed his son a pen and said sign here and meant be complicit, and told himself the boy would never know, who had written in his journal about operations and objectives and outcomes, and Ashford satisfied as though the people in the valley had been an obstacle in a ledger rather than a community with children and stories, and a chief who had said, "Do not make us fools for having trusted you." And at the very end, when dying had stripped away everything he had used to maintain the shape he wanted to be, he had sat down and written it all out and put it in an envelope and sent it to a federal marshal's office, where it had sat misfiled for 3 years. Too late to save anyone, not quite too late to matter. Elias's shoulders moved once, a single small motion quickly controlled. His eyes pressed shut for a moment. Saya, sitting across the room, did not look away. She did not move toward him. She did not offer anything, no comfort, no words, no gesture of consolation. But she did not look away. And somehow that was the thing he needed most in that moment, not to be alone with it, not to have it witnessed with pity, but simply to not be alone. After a moment he opened his eyes. He knew it was wrong, he said, not asking, stating. "It appears so," Voss said. "He did it anyway." "Yes." Elias looked at the confession on the desk, and then at the end he tried to do the one thing he could still do. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it enough for what you need?" Voss looked at the assembled documents, the treaties, the map, the journal, the telegraph message, the 3 sworn testimonies, and now the confession. He looked at them for a long time. "It's enough," he said. "It's more than enough." He stood. "We go to Bozeman tomorrow." They rode back into Bozeman on a Thursday morning in late spring, and the town knew something was coming before they arrived. Word traveled faster than horses in Montana Territory, by telegraph, by stage, by the particular invisible current of rumor that moved through small communities with the efficiency of weather. By the time Voss's small column appeared on the main road, Voss' 2 federal deputies, Elias, Saya, and Briggs' people, had already gathered on both sides of the street. Not a welcoming crowd, not a hostile one either. Something between the complicated attention of people who have been told one version of a story for a long time and are now being asked to sit with the possibility that it was wrong. Voss had arranged it deliberately. The public square, not the sheriff's office. The middle of the day, not the private hour. He had sent word ahead to the territorial newspaper, and a man with a notepad was already standing at the edge of the platform that had been set up in front of the courthouse. He wanted witnesses. He got them. Elias stood to the left of the platform and looked at the faces in the crowd and recognized some of them. Ranchers he had worked for, the livery owner, the dry goods merchant who had given him credit 2 winters ago when money was short. Ordinary people who had built their lives in this town and on this land, and who were most of them entirely unaware of the specific transaction that had made it available to them. Holloway appeared from the direction of the sheriff's office with 2 deputies flanking him. He moved through the crowd with his characteristic ease, the ease of a man who had never had reason to hurry because the town had always arranged itself around his requirements. He saw Voss, saw Elias, saw Saya. His expression shifted through several things in quick succession. Surprise, calculation. Something that might have been the beginning of fear quickly controlled. He composed himself, straightened his coat, moved to the edge of the crowd with his deputies behind him, and waited with the air of a man who has decided to appear untroubled. Voss stepped up onto the platform. He did not begin with preamble. He did not perform authority. He simply held up the real treaty. The oilcloth unwrapped the document visible, the seal catching the morning light, and began to read. He read the full text, every clause, every promise. His voice was level and carried well in the still morning air, and the crowd listened with the particular quality of attention that people give to things they have not heard before but suspect are important. When he finished reading the treaty, he set it down and picked up the forged one. This document, he said, was presented to territorial and federal authorities as the governing treaty with the Red Elk Band of the Lakota Nation. It declares that the band willingly relinquished their land claims in the Ash Creek Valley. He paused. It is a forgery. The seal is copied. The signatures are fraudulent. The event it describes, a voluntary relinquishment, never occurred. The crowd stirred. Someone near the front said something in a low voice. Someone else said, "Let him finish." Voss put the forged treaty down. The attack on the Red Elk settlement at Ash Creek in 1870 was not a response to treaty violations, he said. It was a planned operation to clear land from its rightful occupants in order to facilitate a mining survey and a railroad right-of-way. It was organized by officers of the territorial militia and funded by a private commercial interest. He paused. The documentation supporting these findings includes the original survey, the forged and authentic treaties, correspondence between the organizing officers and their commercial backers, and the sworn testimonies of 3 witnesses including a participant in the original treaty negotiations. The crowd noise had grown, not hostile yet, confused, afraid. A rancher near the center of the crowd shouted, "You telling me the land I've been farming is stolen?" "I'm telling you the legal basis for the original land grants was fraudulent," Voss said. "The Territorial Land Office will be reviewing all grants in the affected area. This will be a process that takes time and will be conducted fairly. No one will be removed from their land without due process and appropriate hearings." "And the Indians?" someone else called. "They coming back for it?" Voss looked at Saya. She stepped up onto the platform beside him. The crowd went quiet in a different way, the particular silence of people confronting something they have been trained to look through and finding they cannot quite manage it this time. She held the real treaty. "My father signed this document," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying the same quality. It always had the precision of someone who has chosen every word and means exactly what she says. He believed the promises in it. He died believing the truth could be found. She looked at the faces watching her. The truth has been found. What happens with it now is the question your town has to answer. She stepped back. Holloway moved. He came through the edge of the crowd with a speed that suggested he had been calculating the point at which the situation had shifted enough that waiting was no longer an option. His hand went to his gun. His voice cut across the square. "Lies," he said, loud, certain. The voice he had used for 20 years to make things become true by the force of his saying them. "Fabrications. This man," he pointed at Elias, "is a traitor who has conspired with enemy elements to manufacture evidence against legitimate territorial officers. These documents are forgeries." He looked at the crowd with the practiced urgency of a man who knows how to use fear. You all have homes here, ranches, businesses. If this story stands, everything you've built is in question. Don't let them do this to you. Da, Jamiyuka, Danami. The crowd wavered. Elias could see it, the pull of what Holloway was offering. The comfort of the familiar story, the appeal to self-interest that was not cynical because it was real. These people did have homes here. They did have something to lose. Holloway's gun came up, pointed at Elias. "I'll finish this myself," he said. The shot came from the left edge of the crowd, not at Elias. Briggs stepped out from between two ranchers, his rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. The shot had taken the gun from Holloway's hand, not the shoulder, not the arm, but the hand itself. A precise and difficult shot that sent the weapon skittering across the platform boards and left Holloway staring at his empty palm with an expression that had no performance in it, only shock. The crowd erupted. People dove, scattered, pressed back against the buildings. Children were pulled behind adults. Someone screamed. Briggs walked forward through the parting crowd. He did not hurry. His rifle was lowered now, no longer aimed, but held in a way that made clear he could raise it again without effort. His wounded arm was held against his side and his face was white and completely certain. He stopped in front of the platform, in front of the crowd, in front of Holloway, who was still staring at his empty hand. "My name is Samuel Briggs," he said. His voice carried. Not loud, the crowd had gone quiet enough that he didn't need loud. "I worked for this man for 6 years. Before that, I worked as a translator for the Lakota Nation during treaty negotiations in 1869. He paused. "I was in that room. I heard what was promised. I watched the signatures go down. And when the men who made those promises burned the village and killed the people who had trusted them, I said nothing." He stopped. "I said nothing because I was afraid. And I told myself it was more complicated than that, and that the right moment hadn't come, and that speaking would only make things worse." He looked at Holloway. "I was lying to myself. Afraid men are very good at that." Mauji ni kottapeidowatsu. The square was completely still. "I am done lying to myself," Briggs said. "Everything Marshal Voss has read here today is true. I will say so under oath before any court that will hear me. I will say so as many times as necessary." He stepped back. Holloway looked at him. The shock had left his face. What remained was the expression of a man watching the last of the structure he had built collapse, not with grief, but with the particular cold fury of someone who had believed themselves invulnerable and has just discovered otherwise. He looked at the crowd. The crowd looked back at him, not with the unified support he had expected, with the fractured, uncertain gaze of people being asked to choose. Voss descended from the platform. He produced the iron cuffs from his coat with the unhurried motion of someone completing an expected task. "Sheriff Wade Holloway," he said, "you are under federal arrest for fraud conspiracy, unlawful seizure of protected lands, and complicity in the attack on the Red Elk settlement at Ash Creek, Montana Territory in 1870. Holloway did not resist. He stood with his injured hand pressed against his coat and let the cuffs be placed, and the only sound was the click of the iron closing and the wind moving through the main street of Bozeman with its cargo of spring dust and the distant smell of the mountains. That afternoon, in the quiet of the federal office Voss had commandeered for the day, the marshal sat down with Elias and said what he had not said on the platform. "Ashford will hear about this by tonight," he said. "He has people in every telegraph office between here and Washington. He will begin his response before we've finished writing ours." "Can he stop it?" Elias asked. "He can slow it, complicate it, throw resources at it that we don't have." Voss folded his hands on the desk. "He has lawyers. He has relationships on the Federal Land Committee. He has the argument that a railroad through Ash Creek Valley represents economic development for the territory and that disrupting it serves no one's interests." He paused. "He won't admit to any of it. He'll call the documents fabricated, question the testimony, suggest that my investigation has been compromised by personal bias or outside influence. And it will take time to work through. Years probably. Courts, appeals, Washington politics." He looked at Elias steadily. "I want you to understand what you've started here. The verdict today is not the end. It's a beginning of something that will be slow and difficult and will not give anyone everything they want." Elias thought about the valley. the dark soil, the shapes of post holes in the earth. "Does Ashford get arrested?" he asked. Voss was quiet for a moment. "I have sent a request to Washington for a federal warrant based on the evidence in his confession and the telegraph message. Whether it is granted—" He stopped. "There are men in Washington who have benefited from the Northern Iron Line's expansion plans. They will not be eager to see this pursued aggressively. So he might walk away." "He might walk away slowly," Voss said, "with difficulty, with this attached to his name in ways that don't disappear." He paused. "That is not justice." "I know it isn't, but it is the honest answer to your question." Elias sat with that for a moment. He thought about his father's letter. "I am told I am dying, and I find I am not able to die without having written it down." The small late act of a man who had done a large early wrong. Not enough, never enough, but real. "What about the land?" he said. "The Red Elk Band has a legitimate legal claim to the Ash Creek Valley under the terms of the authentic treaty." Voss said, "That claim will be registered with the Federal Land Office. The process of restoration will take time and will face challenges from current occupants. Some of those challenges will be legitimate people who had no knowledge of the fraud and built their lives in good faith." He looked at his hands. "There is no clean answer. There is only the honest process." Elias nodded. He stood, picked up his hat. "One more thing," he said. He reached into his coat and produced the deed to his property. The ranch, the land that had come to him through his father's estate when the old man died. He put it on the desk. "The north section," he said, "along the Ash Creek boundary. My father's surveys show it overlaps with the original Red Elk territory." He paused. "I want to transfer it back to the land office for reallocation to the band." Voss looked at the deed. "You're certain?" "It was never mine to begin with," Elias said. "I just didn't know it for a while." Voss picked up the deed, made a note, set it in the stack of documents that had accumulated over 3 days into the shape of something that might slowly over years become a different kind of record than the one it was replacing. The valley was different in the late afternoon. Elias had not planned to come here again today. He had planned to ride back to the ranch, the smaller piece of it that remained, and begin the work of figuring out what came next. There was practical work to do. There was always practical work to do, and he had always been good at using it. But the road passed near the valley, and something in him turned toward it without his full participation, and he followed. He came over the ridge as the sun was moving toward the western mountains, the light going amber and long, laying shadows across the grass that stretched and deepened as he watched. The creek caught the light and held it in pieces. The cottonwoods stood in their clusters, patient as they always were. Saya was already there. She was kneeling in the grass near the center of the valley floor where the darkness of the old soil was most visible, the place where the lodges had stood densest, where the fires had burned longest. She had not heard him approach, and he did not announce himself. He stopped his horse at the ridge's edge and watched. She had a bundle of sage in her hands, dried and silver gray, and she was striking a flint to it with patient, practiced movements until the spark caught and the sage began to smoke pale ribbons of white, curling upward in the still air, carrying the scent of the high country of ceremonies, of things done with intention. She cupped the smoke with her hands and lifted it. She moved it over the grass, over the dark soil, over the shapes of things that remained underneath the new growth. She was speaking in Lakota, quietly, not quite audible from where he stood, but rhythmic in the way of words said in ceremony, the way of words that carry meaning accumulated over generations of saying. He bowed his head. He did not go closer. This belonged to her, and to the people who were not here, and to the people who might someday return to a place that had been taken from them and given back imperfectly and too late, the way most things that matter are given back. He stayed at the ridge's edge and let the ceremony be what it was. After a long time, the smoke thinned and died. Saya lowered her hands. She remained kneeling for a moment, her head down, and then she stood and turned and saw him standing there on the ridge with his hat in his hands. She looked at him without surprise. She came up the slope slowly through the long grass, the eagle feather pendant swaying at her neck, repaired and secure the red thread tight, a thing that had been carried through fire and mended and was still being carried. She stopped a few feet from him. "You didn't come in," she said. "It wasn't mine to come into," he said. She looked back at the valley below them. The smoke had dispersed completely, now lifted and gone. The light was going, the shadows lengthening across the grass in soft gold angles. I prayed for the ones who died, she said, for my father, for the children. She paused. And I prayed for the truth, that it will keep moving now that it's been spoken. She looked at him. Truth doesn't end when you say it once. It has to keep being said. I know, he said. Silence. The wind moved through the grass below them. You didn't save me then, she said. It was not an accusation. It had never been an accusation. It was a fact she was placing between them with care, the way you place something that needs to be named before it can be set down. No, he said. But you stood this time. He looked at her. It's not enough. No, she agreed. It isn't. She held his gaze. But it is real, and real is what we have to work with. The last of the sunlight moved across the valley floor, and the mountains to the west caught it and held it briefly, brilliant and cold before it went. She told him the next morning that she was leaving. He had expected it. He had known since the canyon, since the night around the fire when Briggs had spoken about her father's patience, and she had listened with her hand resting on the treaty. He had known that she was not a person who stopped moving until the work was done, and the work she had was larger than what one valley in one territory could contain. She was packing in the storage room beside the barn, the same room where this had all begun with the same economy of motion she brought to everything. A blanket, dried food, the knife, the treaty wrapped in its oilcloth, tucked carefully into the center of the pack where it was protected from weather on all sides. He stood in the doorway. The Dakota Territory, she said without turning. There are red elk people there, people who scattered after the fire and kept moving. There are people in the Canadian territories too. People who have been living without knowing the treaty exists, without knowing there is a claim. She folded the blanket with the careful precision of someone doing a thing that matters. Someone has to find them, tell them. Tell them what? He asked. She turned and looked at him. That there is still a home, if they want it, if they choose to come back to it. She paused. The valley won't be returned tomorrow. It will take years. But it won't be returned at all if there's no one to return to it. He crossed to the saddlebag on the shelf and opened it. He had packed it the night before while she was sleeping or lying awake, he didn't know which. He had packed it because he had known what the morning would bring, and he had wanted to be ready with the only thing he could offer. He took it down and held it toward her. She looked at it, took it, opened the flap. Inside a folded map, not his father's survey, a different one, drawn by his own hand over 2 evenings with the care of someone who did not have much to offer and wanted to offer it well. The trails north, the passes that stayed open into early winter, the settlements that were safe and the ones that weren't, the locations of federal offices that had been instructed per force's direction to treat Red Elk Band members as persons with legal status and a pending land claim. Alongside the map, a packet of medicinal herbs wrapped in cloth, a sharpened knife, better than the one she had, a small amount of money, not much enough, and at the bottom, a folded letter addressed in his handwriting to Marshal Voss in Helena, explaining who she was and what she was doing, and asking that she be afforded every federal protection available during her travel. She looked at the contents without speaking for a moment. Then she closed the flap and set it with her pack. "You'll stay here," she said. "Someone should," he said. "Someone should be here who knows what the land cost, who can tell the people who come after all of it, not just the parts that reflect well on anyone." She looked at him for a moment with the measuring quality she had brought to everything since the first day, the rapid and accurate assessment that had never been unkind, only clear. "My father said truth needs people willing to carry it," she said. "Not just to say it once, to keep carrying it." "I know," he said. "I'm going to try." She nodded once. Then she shouldered her pack and picked up the saddlebag and walked out of the storage room and into the morning. He followed her to where the horse was tied at the corral rail. She checked the cinch, adjusted the stirrups, secured the pack. All the small, careful preparations of someone who has done this many times and knows how to do it right. She mounted. The eagle feather at her neck caught the early light, clean and precise, the red thread bright. A small made thing that had been carried through years of things that tried to unmake it. She looked at him from the saddle. Not at his face exactly, at him, at the whole of him standing in the morning light with the ranch and the smaller piece of it behind him, and the valley somewhere to the north, and 8 years of distance between who he had been and who he was trying to be. "I won't say goodbye," she said. "Goodbye is too permanent for something that isn't finished." "All right," he said. She turned the horse north and rode. He watched until the distance swallowed her, the figure and the horse and the feather, catching the light one more time before they went over the ridge and the road bent and the land folded around them and she was gone. He stood in the yard for a long time. The morning was getting on. The horses in the corral needed feeding. There was a section of fence on the east pasture that had been needing repair for a week. He had the smaller ranch to tend now and the smaller life that went with it, and both were honestly his in a way that the larger ones had never been. He turned and went inside. On the table in the middle of the space between the two chairs, the eagle feather pendant lay on the wood. Not hers, she had taken it. This was the original, the one she had left the night in the cabin. He had kept it there without quite deciding to, and she had not asked for it back, and it sat on the table in the morning light as though it had always belonged there. He picked it up, held it in his palm. He thought about the valley below the ridge, the dark soil and the new grass growing over it, the water running in the creek, the shapes of things still visible underneath if you knew how to look for them. He thought about Voss in his office in Helena, moving through the slow work of documentation and legal process, and the long patient effort of making something that had been done wrong into something that had at least been acknowledged. He thought about Briggs, who had given his testimony and was now living with the shape of a man who had told the truth late, but had told it, which was not nothing. He thought about his father's letter. "I find I am not able to die without having written it down." He set the pendant back on the table, not discarding it, placing it. He went outside. The morning was broad and clear and cold in the way of Montana spring mornings that are warming towards something better. The mountains stood to the west permanent and indifferent, and the grass moved in the light wind, and the land went on in every direction farther than a person could see from any single point. He had not been redeemed. He was not going to be. Redemption was not the shape of what had happened here. It was too clean a word for something that was going to remain uneven and incomplete and marked by what it had cost to arrive at. But he was standing in it. He was standing in the morning on land that was honestly his, with the truth behind him and the work ahead of him. And for the first time in 8 years, the dark soil of Ash Creek did not press against his chest when he breathed. He went to feed the horses. The day began. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, if it made you sit with something uncomfortable and true, then it did what it was meant to do. Stories like this one exist because the past is not as past as we would like it to be, and the truth has a way of outlasting the people who tried to bury it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories where redemption isn't given, it's earned slowly, imperfectly, and never quite completely. The trail continues.